Every time you follow the discussions or the actions on climate change adaptation, you're most likely to hear about assessments. But what are really these assessments? Why are they so important? Then let me introduce to you why this is becoming important. In fact, first of all, think about any standard problem you may have in life that you may want to solve. What would you do? Initially, you would want to learn about what are the issues, you take stock and see what is the actual problem, and then try to explore actually what do the problems actually mean to the system that you're looking at, and try to think about the solutions. Okay, but how can I solve the problem? And then apply the measures to solve that problem, and then come back later on, or even iteratively, to keep on looking at if the responses you are making are actually working, or the measures you are undertaking are actually working. In climate change adaptation, we actually do assessments to do just the same. And to give you a little bit of a picture on how this works out for a particular country, I'll pick Nepal as an example. Nepal, as part of their preparation of their national adaptation plan, developed a framework to guide their risk and vulnerability assessment. And to start with first, what the country did was to identify what systems or risks, or what systems are at risk the most at the national level. And examples of these systems, for the case of Nepal, included nutrition, for example, forests and biodiversity, public health, urban settlements, water resources, for example, and also it includes cross-cutting dimensions like livelihoods, gender, and so on and so forth. And they looked at these systems at the national level that are important for the economic and social development of Nepal, and that are the ones that the country sees or believes that they will be most impacted by climate change. Then by considering each one of these, then they apply the risk assessment framework. Having considered what are the key systems of development, the country then went deeper to start to think about what are actually the climate hazards to worry about. And in case of Nepal, just like in many other countries, temperature is always of a big concern. And many of you who know the geographic location of Nepal, you know that it is in the Himalayas. And for them, temperature increase is a big problem for the glacial melting, which brings many impacts. So having identified these hazards, or the key hazards that the country would need to worry about, then they went deeper now to define what are the exposure indicators, and how, to what extent and how are the systems exposed to the climate hazards. And I'll pick one example because this was done for all the key economic systems that I identified. Taking for nutrition, for example, they looked at the nutrition. What are the exposure indicators with regard to nutrition? They looked at the farming populations or the farmers. They looked at the laborers, for example, the people employed in farming activities in many ways, including people that are employed in the whole supply chain of the agriculture system. The agricultural land that is available for cropping and so on and so forth, the crops themselves and the livestock and all that, to what extent are they exposed to climate hazards? And the farm infrastructure and facilities, what type of infrastructure, how resilient is that infrastructure? They looked at these exposure indicators in the case of nutrition. And again, still on nutrition, they also looked at some of the vulnerability indicators. What makes their nutrition systems to be vulnerable to climate change? And some of the indicators include income distribution, because that pretty much determines how people may be able to survive in case of a disaster that is brought by climate or weather changes. To what extent is the society dependent on agriculture? And to what extent is the farm infrastructure in good shape, or is in existence to support the farming activities that the country has? And they also looked at gender and age inequalities, which in many cases, many of us know that the young and the old may be impacted differently by climate change. And also there are different responsibilities, especially when it comes to farming, between women and men and so on, depending on the society as well. With the clear knowledge of the risks, it is then possible to identify the adaptation options. And here, generally, two approaches are used. The first approach would use expert knowledge, in which case we can draw upon the existing science, for example, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, on what are some of the standard adaptation approaches that may be applied for particular risks. Then the second part of trying to identify what adaptations can be taken is basically to do stakeholder consultations. For example, indigenous or local knowledge at times proves very useful in this particular context. The society or the community might already have knowledge or practices that they have in place on how to adapt to climate change. Then combining this expert knowledge and the ground roots information can provide a very objective way on what could be the best measures that may be used to adapt to climate change. And of course, climate change is a very consultative and participatory process. So at the end of the day, you will come up with a suite of options. There are many options that could be implemented. And again, to see what measures to choose out of the many options you may come up with, we'll talk about prioritization of adaptation options, which will then help you to understand how people may come from a suite of options to a limited number of options at the end of the day.